Welcome to Urban's Next 50 Changemaker Forum. The program will begin momentarily.
Inequalities, reshape communities, and narrow opportunities for people to thrive. The Urban Institute is no stranger to these realities. From the beginning, we have faced problems head-on, asking the tough questions, seeking the hard truths. It's time for us to step up once again and discover what it would take to create the future we envision. This takes collaboration, trust, vision, and resolve. By working in deeper partnership with changemakers around the country, advocates, mayors, CEOs, policymakers, citizens, empowering them with facts as they lead the way with breakthrough ideas, moving us toward a more just world. Change doesn't come just from good intentions or bold thinking. Change, solutions require data, evidence, knowledge about what works and what doesn't. And Urban seeks that knowledge, unearthing the information today's innovators need as they answer the call to catalyze real change for all our tomorrows. Together, today.
And now, please welcome President of the Urban Institute, Sarah Rosen Wartell.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to the Next 50 Changemaker Forum. I'm so pleased to be in this space with all of you. What is a changemaker? The term makes my board chair cringe. But I've embraced it anyway, because we need more people to own their own power to drive change. Once at Urban, we spoke about informing decision makers. And make no mistake, members of Congress and staff, assistants to the president, deputy assistant secretaries like I once was, and of course mayors and governors too, they are all changemakers. But changemakers are also economists and educators, innovators and inventors, experts in everything from aging to artificial intelligence. They work on humanity's oldest problems, like those who help to feed the hungry and the faith leaders who help to feed our souls. They're activists who are giving voice to their community's demand for jobs and justice. And they are philanthropists and investors, CEOs and social entrepreneurs. Democrats, Republicans, independents, none of the above. And they're the talented young artists who, from the Albany Park Theater Project in Chicago, who performed a powerful piece for all of us here last night. And you, all of you, are changemakers. And that's why we invited you here today, and why I am honored to be amongst you. It used to be that many of us saw the federal government as the only way to achieve change at scale. And it remains vitally important to get federal policy right. But we live in a world where new evidence can go viral, where new ideas from a single tweet, from a single person in a single city can take hold and change lives around the globe. Change can come from companies and from communities. And today, from the right and the left and the center, a newly activated electorate is demanding attention to the forces that shape and disrupt their lives. When change comes from many directions, it's dizzying. But some change is inevitable, and much change can be good. But we know from history that transitions can often be painful. And we must start by acknowledging that today, change isn't working for a whole lot of people. Powerful shifts in technology, climate change, demographics, and global economy are aggravating and hardening inequality. And our future looks like it may be characterized by constrained opportunity and continued injustice. So our collective efforts must aim to harness change to create a future in which everyone in our country can thrive. We at Urban want to help by bringing forward knowledge that empowers this kind of positive change, change that closes opportunity gaps and creates economic mobility and inclusive growth. So we start our next 50 years at the Changemaker Forum, where we've assembled some of the country's leading innovators so that we can set a bold knowledge-building agenda that will help changemakers like you achieve your goals and mission. We're not here today to write policy, but we do want to identify the research that will shape the next generation of policy, and of business, and of philanthropy, and of practice. Society today has more sources of information than ever before, and this power to act proactively based on new insight is a great promise of the data revolution. But success requires that we understand data's limits too. And there are inequities and biases that are baked into it, and we need to confront them at every turn. Success will be built on strong partnerships. Research must reflect a diversity of voices and experiences and involve the population studied in designing the questions and in interpreting the results. In the end, we want to put data to good use to work for you, the changemakers, and your communities. Now it's nearly time to put you guys to work. In a little bit, almost everyone here will be participating in one of 9 knowledge labs. You were invited here for this purpose. We call them knowledge labs because these conversations are designed to craft a knowledge-building agenda, a plan for data mining and research that will power big ideas. So the labs will focus on grand challenges, from educational equity to overflowing prisons, communities that lack good jobs, and cities that lack affordable homes. We know that policy problems, people's lives don't sit neatly in a single silo, and so the work will take us to places where issues intersect. For example, in a conversation about artificial intelligence, we'll stop to ask how the history of discrimination built into our society, how do we prevent it from being perpetuated by our algorithms? In another lab, we'll explore how interventions like housing and food can improve health outcomes and lower medical costs. You are shaping how we will tackle, what we will tackle, and how we'll work in the years to come. And this effort isn't just to set Urban's agenda, although I think that's pretty important, but we're going to share this with researchers and data geeks all around the country so that they can see what they can do to help catalyze change. The knowledge labs are going to be bracketed by 2 plenary discussions, and if you see your program, you'll learn a little bit more about the amazing people participating. And let me note that on the back page is a list of the Twitter handles of the participants. So if you want to join the conversation online, please make sure that you tag them. The first plenary will explore whether technology can be harnessed to solve problems and close equity gaps instead of worsening them. And then this afternoon in our second plenary, we'll hear more about where change comes from and who holds the power to drive it. And later tonight, I hope you'll join us to celebrate the Urban Institute's 50th anniversary, where we'll reflect on the discussions today and what they mean for all of us who believe that facts matter. When this day ends, I hope we leave here with a sense of momentum. We want to go from what would it take to we've got what it takes. For the next 50 years, Urban seeks to be at the center of this kind of dialogue. We want to build tighter and more mutual relationships between analysts like us and changemakers like you. We know knowledge, facts, and evidence are not enough, but we believe in the power of evidence to help changemakers accelerate solutions. I'm so grateful that you're here with us, ready to work, And I'm especially grateful to the many investors that continue to make Urban's work possible. We're thankful to those like the Annie E. Casey, Ford, Rockefeller, and MacArthur Foundations who have consistently partnered with Urban over many decades. And I want to offer special thanks to those who are supporting the Next50 initiatives, both new and ongoing work that are described in this nifty brochure you have, Powering the Next50, and on the screens throughout the venues. These Next50 investors include Arnold Ventures, Robert Wood Johnson, JP Morgan Chase, Kresge, Bank of America, Gates, Mastercard Impact Fund, AARP, and the Joyce Foundation. And I also want to say a special thanks to the Urban Trustees Catalyst Fund as well. Finally, I want to offer a word of special thanks to Brandee McHale. Brandee's the president of the Citi Foundation, and she was the very first person to put a bet on Urban's Next50. And if those of you run nonprofit organizations know, Brandee is the kind of partner that every one of us wishes always to have. She starts by listening, and then she challenges you and pushes you and asks hard questions. And in the end, together, the two of you create something that neither of you could have done on your own. 18 months ago, Citi early investments enabled Urban to start asking, what would it take? That exploration led us here today, and to all of you, to start building an exciting knowledge agenda to improve lives and strengthen communities. Please welcome Brandee McHale.
Oh my goodness, that was a heck of an intro. I'm so happy to be here. First of all, I would just say thank you for whoever decided the little podium behind the podium so I can see all of you. I really appreciate that. Already the day is a success. But I'll just say, you know, walking into this building and now having the chance to look from this perch to see all of you, you know, I was a kid who grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. New Haven was an original model city. I was a graduate student at the New School for Social Research, where some of the best community development researchers did their work and taught others, inspired others. And I'm a Ford Foundation alum, and Ford was an original founding member, a funder of the Urban Institute. So I just have to say, when I say it's truly an honor to be here with you, it is really an honor to be here with all of you today. And I'll just correct one small thing. So when Sarah reached out more than a year ago, 18 months, requesting support to enable Urban to look back on 50 years and look forward on 50 years, you all know the truth. Who could say no to Sarah? Okay, let's be honest. I knew already from the minute the conversation started, the check was in the mail. But I like your story better, Sarah, so thank you. But really, it was a no-brainer for us because at the heart of the Citi Foundation's mission is to support organizations dedicated to leveling the playing field for all people, regardless of their backgrounds. So again, this just made sense for all of us, and we know it made sense for all of you as well. And that's because for a half century, Urban has been the North Star of actionable research, not only on the impacts of the government's war on poverty, but also the private sector's more recent efforts to advance economic opportunity. When President Johnson established the Urban Institute, he sought to create an institution that would, and I'm going to quote here, help solve problems that weigh heavily on the hearts and minds of all of us, the problem of the American city and its people. It is really hard for those of us that have been working in this field for so long to imagine or remember, but before the creation of the Urban Institute, there was no organization in the United States solely dedicated to researching cities. And while we can praise Johnson's vision for creating this beacon of knowledge and research into all things urban for generations to come, actually Johnson was really responding to a very practical challenge. He was responding to what many believed was a threat to the American way of life. The riots of the 1960s tore at the very fabric of society and prompted distrust in the establishment and spurred flight from our cities that ultimately led to massive disinvestment. Now, we all know, those of us in this room, that in response, the federal government created a slew of new social service programs designed to restore our communal trust in government, civic institutions, and society in general. And President Johnson was so wise to recognize that he also needed a trusted ally to assess, is this actually working? Really came down to the idea of making sure that we had data to dispel rhetoric. That was 50 years ago. I feel the need for data to dispel rhetoric every day now, still. So over 50 years, Urban has delivered that high-quality research that is relevant, impartial, trustworthy, and accessible. And, you know, I don't want to underestimate this focus on accessibility, because as Sarah noted, today's decision makers aren't just federal policymakers and administrators deeply steeped in these issues, but today's decision makers also include state and local government officials, private sector business leaders, activists, organizers, and what is really similar to what we saw 50 years ago in the 60s, young people who care deeply about the world around them, but don't necessarily trust our leaders, whether in government or business, to be fair and honest. And so I think trust is really at the heart of why Urban matters. In the past decade, trust in all institutions has steadily eroded. In fact, this year's annual Edelman Trust Barometer revealed that level of trust in institutions has changed profoundly just in the past year. And just in case you were wondering, it is not moving in the right direction. While 2/3 of people do report that they trust their employer to do what's right, this is a significantly higher level than how they feel about nonprofits, NGOs. Trust levels are at 57%, business 56%, government 48%, media 47%. Look around the room. Look at the person next to you. That's all of us. And I don't know about you, but I know that I'm unwilling to live a life where only half of the people I meet actually believe in me and trust in me and my institution. We have to do something about this. And one of the primary reasons for this lack of trust in the system is that inequality is on the rise. You'll hear throughout today, and we all know this, the war on poverty may have begun in the 1960s, but it is not yet won. And similar to President Johnson's quandary of 50 years ago, today's society faces an existential threat rooted in a pervasive lack of trust. If we are going to be effective, we have to acknowledge this trust gap and address it. So where do we start? How do we rebuild this trust? Well, first, like President Johnson, I believe we need a trusted ally that can deliver impartial research and facts. In this polarizing time, yes, Sarah, the facts still matter, and they matter more than ever. The Urban Institute has consistently demonstrated the power of facts to deepen understanding amid division, to inspire solutions, and shape important decisions. Fact-based discourse is the best hope we have of rebuilding trust amongst a skeptical public so that we can overcome our shared challenges. Second, we need to change the way that we work so we can be recognized as trusted problem solvers, not problem makers. That's why we were so excited when Sarah and the team at Urban framed today's event as a Changemaker event. Today is an opportunity for all of us to help nurture a more constructive dialogue and work towards solutions. And so throughout the day, and even more importantly than today, today's the beginning. When you leave here, I'd ask you to continually assess you and your institution's role in being a trusted problem solver by asking yourself these 3 questions. What are you and your organization doing to help create inclusive and resilient communities? How can you and your institution use not just your financial resources, but use your voice to help drive dialogue towards solutions? And are you and your institution walking the talk? Are you doing the right things for your own people and the communities that you work in? Now, today is not just about coming up with new ideas. We have all been to far too many events where we just talk about ideas after idea after idea. Today is really, I feel like it's the beginning of our journey to work together in new ways as trusted allies, energized and motivated to drive what my colleagues at Living Cities refer to as dramatically different outcomes. As a grant maker, I know there is no deficit of good ideas out there, but timing is everything, and we need to act now and together invest in a few big ideas that can help turn the tide back to shared prosperity for all. So on behalf of all of my colleagues at Citi and the Citi Foundation, I want to thank you all for coming here today. I am personally grateful for the chance to be here with all of you, and I look forward to rolling up my sleeves with you in the Knowledge Labs this afternoon and developing game-changing, change-making innovations. Thank you.
Please welcome Jacob Shue, Vivienne Ming, Shamina Singh, Darren Walker, and Donald J. Baer.
Thank you. Isn't it nice that the voice of God is a woman?
Yeah!
It's a little change making there. That's good. Before we get started with the panel, I want to do one thing. I'm a member of the board of the Urban Institute, and we've been hearing for several years about the move to this phenomenal new building and facility. First time I'm here, and I am blown away. I just want to say to Sarah and to her remarkable team that she leads, congratulations for being here, for getting here, and I think we ought to all give them a round of applause. This is amazing, Jamie. So we're going to talk. Does it tell you up here what it is? That's good, so I don't have to say too much about it. We're here to talk about technology's power to advance opportunity and equity. And before I do more to introduce our guests, I want us to pause a minute and think about technology and how we imagine technology. And honestly, when we are being idealistic, maybe even naive about technology, I think our fundamental conception is that technology is supposed to be in service to people. It's supposed to help make people's lives better in some way or another. And that's how we have hoped to experience technology throughout the course of history. But if we pause a minute, and I'm not just referring to things that we have come to understand in the last couple of years, across history, there's always the risk that that formula gets inverted, and that people wind up in service to technology, not the other way around. That we wind up really as ingredients into the inexorable force of technological change that maybe pulls us along with it, but maybe doesn't, and sometimes grinds a lot of people under as we go and doesn't make lives better. And what we're here to talk about today is how we can harness the power and the force of technology and technological change so that we can do more to help ensure that technology serves people rather than the other way around. We have an excellent panel here and group of guests to help us with this. They've been introduced once. Jake Shue, who is the CEO of Catalyte. Vivienne Ming, who is the executive chair and co-founder of Socos Labs. Shamina Singh, who is founder and president of Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth and the executive vice president of corporate sustainability at Mastercard. And Darren Walker, who is the president of the Ford Foundation. So thank you all for being with us. We're going to go at this for about an hour, so there's a lot of room to talk. I don't remember whether, is there time for questions? I should have asked this a long time ago. From the audience?
No.
Hold those questions. You can sort of rush the stage afterwards, and we can do all of that then. So And also, I do want to make this one point. There was only one point that I was told I had to make, which is that one of the knowledge labs that is following this discussion is going to focus on the same subject, and building on the knowledge changemakers need to harness with regard to artificial intelligence and how that can advance employment equity. But right now, we're going to talk about really how do we use it to create opportunity and to drive greater equity. And as I've said before to people, AI has a big PR problem, so you get to talk about that more specifically as we get into it. But we'll have some more time for that here as well. So the first thing I want to do is actually put a question to the whole group. And ask you to pick one application of technology. And by application, I don't necessarily mean an app on your iPhone, but it could be. An application of technology that is going to result, in your view, in transformational change over the next few decades. And for some people who are perhaps not as immersed in the consequences of this transformation, help us all imagine the future and think about how that technology will help to expand people's ability to access opportunity, and what do we need to do, more importantly, to help make sure that that happens, because as I've said, it can slide off into the wrong direction without that insurance. So Darren, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here, and congratulations, Sire. This is really remarkable. So my great frustration with these conversations is that we immediately go to talking about applications, about innovation, without spending the time to talk about context. And so the context for technology is, in this country, a system of democracy and capitalism that is always in tension. And I've had many of these conversations with Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who for a number of years was on the board of the Ford Foundation and was the founder of the World Wide Web. And I think Tim's initial idea, which was that the web was going to propel democracy and access and inclusion, is obviously a utopian idea. And I think Tim would agree that it is veering towards dystopia rather than utopia. And part of the reason for that is because an idea that was in some ways naive in the public interest has been mostly privatized for private interest. And we actually need to define what is the public interest in this new digital world, and what is the public interest in a democratic capitalist society. And I would say the moniker for me is the hearings that we have seen of technology companies on the Hill, which really were about the intersection of democracy and capitalism. And so I think for example, in the Zuckerberg hearings, it was an intersection of democracy and capitalism, and democracy lost. Mm-hmm. Democracy lost in part because there is so little capability in government to actually respond to the tsunami of private capability. And so the public interest has actually been defined by the private sector, right? So yes, we have an FCC, yes, we have an FTC, yes, we have a government, but if we're to be honest, we know that it is undercapacitated. And we saw that when we saw members of Congress asking almost comical questions that were embarrassing on behalf of the people, because there was no one sitting behind them, as there is in any other sphere of American life, financial services, the environment, you name it. There's some group of smart people sitting behind that congressperson, passing them index cards saying, he's wrong, here's the right.
Anyone who's ever done that, raise your hand.
and in any other sphere, healthcare, you name it. But we know some of those people had no one sitting behind them. And didn't even
They
know
were all
the
tweeting,
question.
so they weren't able to.
Yeah, they weren't there. And they weren't there because they haven't been hired into government. And yes, there are episodic, I think under invested in mechanisms where people are being brought into government. But we've got to accelerate that. So what I am concerned about is a future in which we have simply ceded the question of the people's interests, broadly speaking, in a democracy, in a system that is really about monetizing our data and our information, and that is ultimately harmful to our democracy and the notion of justice in our society.
So is your answer to the application that we need more human beings who are involved?
My answer is that we need what we did in law in the 1960s. There was no such thing as public interest law before the 1960s. A field was created. Systems of education were changed. The law school curriculum was changed. New institutions were built. Legal clinics were introduced into the legal education. Postgraduate fellowships for smart young lawyers to say, you actually don't have to go to Davis Polk and Wardwell. You can go and work for a public interest organization. You can work in this new field called environmental law that did not exist, that today we think of as completely normative. We think of the environment as always a tension between our public interest in the environment, in a clean, healthy environment, and the way the government has actually built an agency. And there are thousands of environmental lawyers running around this country protecting the people's interests. We should have that same scheme in technology.
You know, if I could link that back around, I'll give you, I could give you a dozen technologies that I think would be really fascinating to discuss. So I'm going to pull one in that might seem totally out of left field, but I want to tie it back to what you were just talking about. So a week and a half ago at MIT, I attended a neurotechnologies conference, and it's supported by a group that's funded by Eric Schmidt and Reid Hoffman and a variety of others. So lots of talks by neuroscientists. So that's part of my background. I was a theoretical neuroscientist at UC Berkeley and Stanford before I became an entrepreneur, and then I do the crazy stuff I do now. And so I went to school to learn how to build cyborgs. I'll just be really transparent about that. It just seemed like the coolest thing in the world to me. And now, these technologies aren't 10 years out. They're literally right now. I actually work with a startup where you can slap a little thing on your head, and for 2 hours, you are literally smarter. We could go into the details, but
I want that technology.
absolutely. I will take volunteers. I guarantee success in all of the survivors. So, to throw out a technology, but then I want to tie it back. These, what we call neuroprosthetics, literal technology devices that either non-invasively or invasively, literally inside your brain, interface, these are being built right now today, not just for people that are paralyzed, but for cognitive, emotional, social prosthetics. And to me, this has two potential futures. One in which, for example, we know with excruciating molecular detail how childhood household stress and poverty permanently causally reduces working memory span, which is a huge predictor of life outcomes. If you could go, I'm not saying that this is the right way to do it, but if you could go and wave a magical technology wand and give that back to a kid, how could you not? But then that event had the scientists, and it had the billionaires, and then it had the entrepreneurs. And some of them were amazing people, former colleagues of mine transitioning out of science into building something I did 12 years ago. But a lot of them, boy, they remind me of Mark Zuckerberg, who built a hookup site at Harvard. And then the world told him that he was democratizing everything. And I think he really believes it. and it just so happened it also made him one of the wealthiest men in the world. Who wants Facebook in their head? Because I'll tell you, that's exactly what half the entrepreneurs there were thinking is, this is the new green field, and I'm going to get in on it before there's regulation and before there are norms and standards. And so we've got these two possible futures. One where you could fundamentally transform some of the basics of what it means to be human for good, for people that desperately need it, whether it's Alzheimer's or traumatic brain injury, where I do my work, one of my pieces of work, or it's a sweet 16 gift that wealthy families give their kids. And once there are two kinds of humans, we never go back. And I know it sounds like science fiction, but I'm telling you, 10, 20 years from now, this is how it will be.
Shamina, by the way, I'm so scared now. I think I'm just we're deep. Shamina, how do you address all this?
Well, I thought we agreed in the green room. I'm not supposed to follow Vivienne. Like, that's not Jacob. Thanks for having me, and congratulations, Sarah, for everything here. You know, President Johnson was my favorite, is my favorite. I did go to LBJ school, so I feel an affinity towards him. And I feel like what Urban is doing now, preparing for the Next 50, is exactly why I called Sarah when we first started the Center for Inclusive Growth at Mastercard to say, what does this thing need to look like, and what are we supposed to be doing with it? Because she has a future-forward approach to doing all of this work. And so listening to Darren, listening to Vivienne, and I know when I listen to Jake, who I adore, I think it's about, at least the application for the Next 50, is about data. It is about equality. These words do not belong, equality, justice, to the public sector. They belong to everybody. And so I wrote a piece a couple of years ago talking about this notion of information inequality and this idea that because I sit in a company as an independent subsidiary, but in a company that understands that power of data and technology and things like that globally, I could see the gap, and I can see the gap that's forming between the data haves and the data have-nots, much to your point. But I see it right now. And Sarah also helped me understand what that looks like. And so I do think it's still about information inequality. And frankly, the more I learn about it, the more I understand that had we had more information equality, we might not have as much income inequality as we do today. It's this fundamental gap between people who know things and people who don't know things. So it is about data for me, but it's about data in its most essential form. It's about data for ID and who owns, it's going back to basics, but it's with a future forward framework. So it is about who is Shamina, who am I, and then who am I compared to Sarah, and who says I'm Shamina, and it's the ownership of the data. And I think for that reason, and a bunch of other ones, was the reason why we first worked with Urban and Sarah a couple of years ago to really start answering this idea of what is information inequality, what does data philanthropy look like, and at that time it was because the center didn't have any money, so all we had data, and so we said, okay, what would a data grant look like to help advance Urban's thinking around a lot of important issues. And today it's about thinking about where we are now, where we have to be in the next 50 years, and why we're at least starting now, or continuing rather, to partner with Urban to say, look, we just announced we're doing a $2 million grant for 2 years to help figure out how Urban is going to help policymakers at the local and national levels help us navigate the digital economy. Because there is the technology of it, but it's also the fear around it. And so if we can work together to help navigate the digital economy, we say making it work, the digital economy, making it work for everyone everywhere, then what better partner than the Urban Institute to help us all figure that out?
Great. Jake,
yeah.
What's your view of this?
Well, so I'll share what we're doing. So my company is called Catalyte, and we're a data science company that is helping companies build technology workforces all over the country. Now, what's unique about our approach is we're using AI and predictive analytics to find people from all walks of life, literally talking about musicians, artists, fast food workers, truck drivers, people from all walks of life that we then we identify people with this remarkable potential, this exceptional people who have this innate potential and ability that would predict for success in long-term careers as software developers. We then literally hire them, oftentimes sight unseen, put them through a full computer science degree in just 20 weeks, and then basically put them to work delivering engineering services for our clients. What's interesting is that I always tell people this is not kindergarten engineering. This is actually real hardcore stuff. I mean, it's literally building cutting edge products and services for companies like PayPal and Nike and Under Armour, to running mission critical systems for companies like Kroger and Centene and Nationwide Financial. So it's real serious engineering work. And so today I can tell you 3 very interesting pieces of good news that I have to share with everybody. The first piece of good news is that we've now proven with data, and we've had a number of clients who've actually published data about this also in public forums, that shows that our teams have on average been 3 times more productive than incumbent engineering teams. So we're literally taking people who come from these non-traditional backgrounds, and they're actually outperforming classically trained software developers. They're producing higher quality, they're doing it faster, they're ramping up faster. I mean, across the board, the metrics are pretty amazing. The second piece of good news actually is really around diversity and inclusion. So we've actually proven that using this new hiring model, and literally we don't look at anything about a person's background. So by design, we don't have any resumes, we don't want to ingest any information about your background. We basically ask you to take a 2-hour online assessment, and we hire you based entirely on how you do on that assessment. But what's interesting is actually, we end up with a workforce that generally reflects the demographics of the cities that we hire from. So, we're headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland, and it's, that's a city now that's kind of known for the wire and corrupt mayors. It's not really known for technology, but we've actually built, it's our longest running development center, and we set up there for a purpose, right? Is really to kind of make a statement. And so the data is very encouraging. So over the last 6 years, the Baltimore metro area has been about 28% African American when you include the city and the county. Our workforce there over that same period of time has been 29% African American developers. And that's without any human intervention. No thumb on the scale there. In terms of gender, we're over a quarter female developers. Those are probably twice the industry average. If you look at the average age of people coming in, it's 33 years old, right? And it ranges anywhere from 17-year-olds to 72-year-olds. And what's more interesting is actually also on sort of degrees. Only half of our workforce has a 4-year degree. A third have a high school education, right? We've really now proven using data that, when you're really assessing based on sort of potential and ability, you actually end up with a workforce that generally looks like the cities that you hire from. So we're proving that adage that talent and ability is truly evenly distributed. Now, the last piece of good news is something that we've actually recently had validated from an independent third party, which is really the long-term impact of what we're doing. So we've actually shown now that the typical Catalyte employee, the salary that they had in the last job before they joined the company was $25,000 a year. Within 5 years, the average salary that they're making, and we're paying them, is $95,000 a year. Within 6 years, the majority is making 6-figure salaries, and it continues on from there. When people leave, they continue on to long-term success. 94% of our alumni, people who have left the company, stay on its long-term careers in software development, right? So again, when you start thinking about sort of the ability to actually start harnessing these technologies and techniques to actually create much more democratized and equitable outcomes, it's absolutely possible. It's actually a failure of imagination, I believe, that we're not doing more of this. If you ask me the long-term vision, next 50 years, our goal really is to be like the Harry Potter sorting hat, right? Is that, we want to kind of, have a person take a 2-hour assessment and then direct them to any number of long-term careers that they could be very successful at and give them those on-ramps into those careers.
So it's a very provocative opening, and it leads in so many different directions. Darren, I'm going to come back to you, and maybe this seems like rushing way ahead to the end of the story, because we're going to go into some other directions here as well. But all of these visions, the ability to really harness technology and change for good, do you have a sense of how we will know if we've succeeded or if we are succeeding? Is there any way to sort of look at the road that we will be on and know whether we're on the right course or not?
Well, I would say for me, for my institution, for the Ford Foundation, which has a focus and a mission on justice in the world, we will have failed in this new digital era if the discrimination, prejudice, racism, and other forms of isms that we have in the analog world is simply replicated in the digital world. And so we can look across the world as it is today, and we can see where there is discrimination at a meta level, and then we can look at industry. And let's just pick something. Predatory lending, and the way in which in the analog world, bad actors in financial services in that industry prey on vulnerable Americans, prey on low-income people, on African-American communities, brown communities, immigrant communities are often victimized. And that's a fact. So that's not ideological, that's not political. We know from the data. We also are seeing in this new digital world that AI and other innovations have actually accelerated the capability to victimize vulnerable people. So there are data sets that can be constructed that within seconds can actually tell you in a state every census tract where there is an African American. And you can design a program to target that data set for predatory products and bombard them with predatory products within seconds. In the analog world, that sometimes took years to construct and execute and implement and see the returns on. Mm-hmm. You can do that now, literally in a matter of days. And so we will fail if we see that replicated at an accelerated pace with the velocity that actually victimizes more people, mm-hmm. and exacerbates the inequality that we see in the analog world that Brandee spoke so eloquently about. We potentially will see more of that faster happening, and we will be harmed as a society.
So that's how we fail. How do we succeed?
Well,
I come back just the absence.
Exactly.
Of failure,
I don't want to be here just to diagnose the problem. Mm-hmm. I am a capitalist. I believe in our system. I do not believe the current system is producing the kind of shared prosperity that our democracy needs to be sustained. And so there has to be, returning to where we started, at least from my standpoint, and the overarching issue here is if we have a system that can prevent that from happening, or at least can regulate that, then there is a chance.
It also occurs to me that if data and analytics can identify for predatory lenders who the easy marks are, you can also identify who they might be and get to them first.
Well, you can identify
different kinds of opportunities that keep them from falling prey.
That's right. But the good actors are already doing that. So we're, again, in the analog, just like in the analog world, Citi isn't going out doing, the good actors are already out there doing that in the digital world. It's that the bad actors, and it's always the bad actors who give the whole industry and do the biggest harm, right? So the point is just understanding that when we talk about things like data, when these things in the analog world, data are flawed. The data that we look at for making parole decisions in the current analog world are flawed. We are now, through AI, having predictive analytics And so state parole boards are relying on AI to tell them who to parole. And that AI, in some places, we already know from evidence, good research, is being constructed from flawed data sets, right? And so we can look across our society in every domain, and so we just can't say data is going to solve this, because data are not neutral often.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to, again, connect a couple of thoughts together, and obviously I'm going to strongly agree with you. I should do a preamble, because what I'm about to say might sound a little bleak. I spend my days building these sorts of systems to try and do good in the world. We built a system to reunite orphan refugees with extended family members based on face recognition. I built the first ever AI to treat diabetes, a system that could predict manic episodes in bipolar sufferers. You can do good in the world with these if you choose to do good. And I'd love to spend time talking about that choice, because it's not just opportunity. Choice itself is fundamentally inequitably distributed. But I was the chief scientist of one of the first companies doing AI and hiring. And we built a tool. So we didn't do the hiring ourselves. In fact, that was when I finally broke apart from the founders, it was that issue. I said, we should just do this ourselves. We built these things, and what we found was people have been studying hiring for 100 years. Recruiters give you 5 seconds. They look at your name and your school and your last job. So it turns out none of those are meaningfully predictive of anything. They're predictive of whether you get hired. But it turns out, and this may be a big shock to some in the policy space here, whether you go to university or not is not a big causal influence on the outcomes of your life. I know that that is seen as a huge policy lever here in Washington, but there is very little evidence to indicate that going to university changes people's lives. If you look for the things that university is a signal of, we did that ourselves through dumb luck. They did through strategy. You find that knowing how to program doesn't predict how good a programmer you are, strangely enough. Having a Bachelor of Computer Science from Stanford, small positive predictor of your ability as a software developer. But the kind of qualities that got you there, a strong sense of purpose, resilience, perspective, social skills, we found were just as predictive of the success of software developers as it was of salespeople. So I'm saying all of this on this side to now connect back up, because I'm about to say something provocative, which is the current approach to artificial intelligence is fundamentally incompatible with civil rights.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So true.
So right now, in the time we've been here, a huge percentage of you in the audience were passed over for a job, for a loan. Your kids were passed over for admission to university. For many of us, you might have gotten extra scrutiny from the police, and you weren't aware of any of it. If any of that was done because you were a woman or some sort of algorithmic redlining, how did you even know? You can't take action against it because you weren't even a participant. It happened in a couple of milliseconds and then it was done. If you didn't fit their model of the right person to hire, you don't get the job. You don't get a chance to say, yeah, they asked me if I was pregnant. They figured out you were pregnant from your Facebook profile. And no human did, an algorithm did. And so I'm being so pessimistic because after I was the chief scientist at Guild, I got the best, I get a lot of fancy smancy job offers. I've never taken one, but this was the pitch that actually got me to go interview. In 7 years, we, Amazon, will be a 1 million person company, and your job will be to make their life better. First time ever, I went up and I met with everyone. And what was very clear is Jeff's definition of better is different than mine. And at the time, amongst the many things I would have been involved in would be, for example, a system they develop now, which is doing automatic termination of warehouse employees that are not meeting productivity standards. But another is a hiring system. So a big, deep neural network, the sort of modern face of artificial intelligence, to decide who Amazon should hire. And if you followed the news at all, you may have seen about a year ago, it came out that they built this thing, they spent years working on it, and it would not hire women.
Or people of color.
Or, yes, that's true also. Trust me, if it wouldn't do one, it wouldn't do the other. And guess where it learned it from? I actually got a call once when I was the chief scientist of Guild. Dr. Ming, Google just labeled a black couple as gorillas. Is AI racist? I said, it's pretty much like the rest of us. It depends on how you raise it. If it never sees any black faces, guess what? And the shocking thing is, that was 10 years after my very first project, the project where I actually learned how to do the face recognition stuff for the refugee project, was actually sponsored by the CIA. So as an undergrad, I worked on a project to do real-time lie detection off of raw video. It was all public academic stuff, all published, getting used in Western China in terrible ways now. And so we built this stuff, and it was cool. And at the time, we saw a demo of the first ever high-quality real-time face recognition system. And it was just amazing. You could hold up a dollar bill and track George Washington. It'd pick out the audience, except it wouldn't have found everyone in the audience. And I bet you can guess who it wouldn't have found. They threw up a picture of the crew of the Enterprise, the fake one, not the real one. And it missed one person. It didn't find Uhura. And the guy says, Paul Viola, a genius, and he says, yeah, we know this is a known problem. This is like 1999. You know, the internet's overwhelmingly white. We trained it on that. We know we're going to fix this. And then 10 years later, it hasn't been fixed. Right. And if you follow the news again, 10 years after that, now this young researcher at MIT has shown...
Joey Bulamwena.
There we go. Has shown that, I don't remember, my wife has not caught on to the fact that I only refer to her as my wife. I'm not good with names. So you know, it's 20 years later, and systems that we are selling to decide who gets jobs. People are using face recognition for for hiring. Who gets through border security? Who gets on planes? If you are a dark-skinned woman, it is not ready for the real world. If you are a dark-skinned man or a light-skinned woman, arguably, it's not ready. And yet, we just described the vast majority of people on this planet. It is a mystify to me. If we want AI to be involved in the court system, fine. It is an expert witness to be cross-examined, and I should be able to bring my own expert to bear, my own AI built by the ACLU, explaining why I should get bail, why I should get parole.
Will be.
So I'm in talks with them about working on a project like that.
To Darren's point, there need to be people trained who can be those experts. I want to, many downsides, right? And we'll come back to some of them, because part of the challenge is how do we mitigate and mute the downsides. I want to come back, though, because it's been raised already. You're a capitalist, I happen to be one as well, about the private sector. And Shamina, I want to come to you to talk about what more can and should the private sector do to help assure that many of these technologies are being applied and used in such a way that they are actually helping to advance equity and create even more opportunity for people. How do we make sure that that side of it becomes more dominant than the downside?
I think it's interesting because if we're thinking about today and then 50 years from now, I think I'll shoot myself in the head if we're still talking about private sector and public sector. And so I think that if, because nobody looks at themselves. Like, I don't know, Don, you've worked in both public and private. You probably don't think of yourself as a private sector guy on a Monday and a public sector guy on a Tuesday. You're just Don. And so...
Just on an airplane.
You're just on airplanes. It's the same thing. If we are sitting here 50 years from now talking about the private sector is doing it one way and the public sector is doing it another way, and we have to one has to regulate the other because the other doesn't know right from wrong, that's a bunch of horse shit. Like,
although that's the model.
That's the but I'm just
all capitalism.
Hold on,
I mean, that's not.
I don't think because hold on a second. Because if I look at what I'm seeing right now, you do have one version. You've talked about one version of sort of data and things like that. The version that I'm sort of talking about is this idea that you build technology, and Vivienne, you can tell me if I'm wrong or right, but you build technology for what's coming because we all know what's coming. It's not that technology is some big secret. We all know that it's coming. It's here. Our jobs as people who are in positions of authority and privilege is to make sure that we use our positions of authority and privilege to do the right thing. Now, your right thing and my right thing might be two different things, but there is some semblance of decency. And I'll give you an example. So I work at a company that deals with payment technology, buying and selling. Brandee talked about trust. People who can't see each other, people don't know each other. And so the system that our data lawyers and our privacy people are saying is that data belongs to the individual. The individual owns their data. And we're going to build a system that is called privacy by design. We're building our technology to ensure that because we are a company who wants to make money at the end of the day, we know that the data is going to belong to the individual. So we're just going to go ahead and place a bet and say, that's how we're going to build our technology, because that's what we're going to advocate, and that's how we're going to do it. There are companies, this is the fight that's happening right now. This is not a fight that's saying one company is going to do data as a commodity, and one is going to say data belongs to the individual. It's a decision, it's a choice. And so I just don't feel like the private sector abdicates a responsibility for building things the right way because the public sector is going to regulate. There is something called decency, and there's something called self-regulation.
But is that a decision and a choice that each company that's in the business of taking in data and using it is making, or is it a choice that society makes and says, you're all part of this society and therefore you will follow this protocol? And depending, if it's one that individual companies, for instance, make, how do we ensure that the bad actors, if you want to call them that, don't become more dominant than the good actors or take advantage of everyone? And if it's the other way, where society is supposed to essentially come to some sort of conclusions about what's in the better interest of everyone, how do we get there? How do we get to that kind of conclusion?
So when you mentioned that we had sort of followed each other giving some talks at Kellogg. So I get invited. I try not to be offended as a scientist that I get most of my academic invitations for business schools nowadays. But
yes.
I'm sorry, that was my son's diabetes alarm going off. So I do give a lot there. And one of the things I often share is social entrepreneurship is bullshit. There's a little talk I give. Forgive me for going blue. But one of the things I really try to get across is what I call my Lark's vomit theory of entrepreneurship. So it's a reference to the old Monty Python skit, and this audience is old enough. Nobody gets it at universities anymore. So it's the Wizzo chocolate assortment. So if you remember this one, it's this constable interrogating the purveyor of the Wizard chocolate assortment set, which is increasingly disgusting and dangerous set of chocolates. And it doesn't culminate, but near the end is ram's bladder cup. So it's a fondue of lamb's bladder flown in from Iraq, whipped into a fondue, and then lovingly garnished with lark's vomit. And the constable says, lark's vomit? Where does it say anything about lark's vomit? And he says, right here in the ingredients after monosodium glutamate. And he says, there should be a big label that says, warning, lark's vomit. And the purveyor responds, but our sales would plummet. And I feel like if you put your monetization model on a big banner on your landing page and your sales would plummet, you may not be doing something right.
That's right.
There was the CEO of a company called Unroll Me, which was a free service. You just hit a button and it unenrolls you from email subscriptions. And then it came out, they were reading the details of people's emails and using it for ad targeting. And her response is, how did people think we were making our money? Too much, which is a fair statement from her perspective, but mine would be, because you could have told them.
Right.
And if you don't have a viable business as a result, then it was never a viable business. It was a scam. Mm-hmm. But I still think these are open choices for people to make. So let me throw out another possibility. We have the public sector, huge role. We have the private sector. It has a role. But I got to say, one-sided commitments and guidelines and advisory boards that no one actually has to listen to isn't going to solve these problems. Then we have what I call the individual sector, which is, I made an allusion to it earlier, which is, what if groups like my lab working with the ACLU could go and actually build things to actually empower people to make their own decisions about their data. So the advertisements you see on Facebook are the result of a giant auction, none of which you are involved in, despite the fact that you're the product being auctioned off. And wouldn't it be amazing if you could have a role in that instant auction where it could say, no, I don't want to see that ad. If you want to show me that one, you have to pay me a little bit more. But more profound as we go on and on, if I could have an AI that, this is what I'm advocating for, a civil right to have artificial intelligence unambiguously acting on your individual behalf playing a role in these decisions, like who gets a job, who gets a loan, the things that are fundamental to our lives and have been used abusively for years to keep large sections of society out of civil life, we're going to find ourselves right back there again. And I will finish with this. It doesn't even require these systems to be wrong. Yes, there's bias we know in the data in hiring. Yes, there is intentional bad actors. But I don't have to think Jack Ma or Larry Page are bad guys to think that of the 12 people that meaningfully control artificial intelligence in the world today, their self-interest is not my self-interest. In fact, the self-interest of a company to decide who they want to hire is not necessarily my self-interest in wanting to be hired in those jobs.
So, yep, sorry.
No, go ahead. But I think we have a possibility for a future where we can actually support individuals in making ownership.
So I want to
of that.
play off of that and talk about participation, meaningful participation in the economy, and taking full advantage of opportunity in the economy. And again, come back to this question about bias or prejudice, really. How can, because you're working in this field, how can technologies be used, how are they being used, and how could they be scaled from where they are now to help reduce prejudice and bias and open up more lanes for opportunity for people, so we can get past some of the horror stories that we know exist?
So I think there are three things that, at least some lessons that we can share. So I think first is really be mindful about how you design it. So by design, we ingest no demographic data. So I don't know anything about an individual, and none of our models have any demographic data in there at all. Right, so I don't, so we, that's one of the flaws I find with a lot of companies that are in this assessment space, is that they usually start from some archetype of what a successful person looks like, and then they kind of work backwards to design a test or design a game or something to find more people like that. We don't have a specific profile, so people always ask me what makes for a successful software developer. I can't really tell you. Just like I can't really tell you what is a successful leader, what's the ingredients to make a successful leader. The answer is there's a lot of different signals for that. So what we do is that we actually start from the data set, right? So, and the second lesson I'll share here is that the data set needs to be quantifiable, right? I think 300, the most insidious thing in modern corporation is like the 360-degree review, right? Which are basically these assessments based through human filters. So what does our data set start with? It really begins with answering the question, what does excellence look like in a job, right? For a software developer, we actually started off with basically amassing a 20-year data set around agile sprint metrics. These are basically it's just an engineering process, right? So we just ingested all this data around sort of, well, how have companies been doing in terms of their sprints? You can tell a lot about productivity and velocity and quality and ramp-up times, all that stuff from really just very standardized. We use something called safe metrics. So that was the beginning point. Then that got combined with all of sort of the training data, all the sort of experience curve sort of development data. That data set then is basically what we use to basically backtest all these predictive theories against. We actually don't come up with these ourselves. We actually take them from places like the Urban Institute or other research organizations that are studying this idea of potential every day. And what we do is we basically backtest these theories, these models against this data set. And we update this algorithm that today has a little over 500 different models in there. We update that every quarter based on updates to our data set. And again, so when what's interesting about this is that when we took out, when you don't look at sort of demographics, you actually end up with a workforce that basically reflects the demographics of the communities you hire from, right? Again, it goes back to this point that when you really look at sort of excellence and what those predictors are of excellence, they really don't have anything to do with any particular profile of person. So I always say it's kind of like a recipe stew, right? So as long as people hit enough of these models, they score high enough in enough of these signals, they're hired. But I think that's also, but another critical point also is that technology alone doesn't solve the problem. So just assessing and finding that person isn't enough, right? So there's a whole sort of, how we train people, how we actually, how we mentor them, how do we actually give them these sort of precision performance feedback loops and things, how do we measure actually their success? These are all sort of best practices that can be shared, but I'll just share one thing is that I think, we don't try to dumb down the program. In fact, like I said, our training is basically a off-the-shelf computer science degree from a university that's been compressed to 20 weeks. But what we did actually was make it team-based. Right? So from day one of the things that we were able to pull through 9 out of 10 people. So of the people who actually pass our assessment and join training, 9 out of 10 go on to become permanent software developers in the company. But we're able to pull people through because we've made it sort of team-based, right? And I think that's something that, in a lot of ways, the education system is going the wrong way, where we're kind of moving to these kind of individualized, like online community colleges and things like that, where it's sort of like, they're trying to teach you, you sort of do it by yourself. The modern software development is a team sport, right? And I think one of the reasons why we're able to pull a lot more people through this training program, and by the way, it's meant to be hard. We call it productive struggle, so it's meant to be hard. The only way to get through it is to go through it. But we also tell people the only way you're going to make it through it is actually you're going to have to do this as teams, right? So our training cohorts every week break into new teams to solve this material together. And there's just as much peer learning as there is sort of instructor-led learning, to make this whole thing happen.
Great.
I will try to keep this quick, but I think if I could put 2 phrases in your mouth, there's one thing we do in our work so Socos Labs is this crazy idea. I started about 3 years ago. It's the worst business idea ever. People come to us with problems to solve, anything involving people. And if I think we can do something unique and make a difference, then I pay for everything and we actually go do it. So we don't take any donations, we don't do anything. My life's been good to me, and this is how I'm going to spend the rest of it. And we work in health and mental health, education, workforce, innovation itself, neuroscience, and beyond. I say all of that to explain some of my background here, which is we do a lot of work in education. The number one request we get from parents in our education work is, how is my child doing relative to other kids? And our only response can be, I'm so sorry, but if you want to know that, you'll have to find it someplace else.
That's a better question than, can my kid be on the sailing team?
Well, not everyone has $1 million to pay the sailing coach at Stanford. So, but in fact, what I want to tell everyone is, I don't care who your child is. I don't care who your potential hires are. I care who they could be and what it would take to get them there, including which group of people will they be with, such that their weaknesses and everyone else's weaknesses are complemented against the strengths of everyone else on the team. And you can't understand a person outside of that context. And I will add this one last very wonky detail, which is we've talked a lot about data, but I think what you talked about was causality. What do we know causally makes for great employees? And can you either find that or give it to someone? And the answer is absolutely yes in both cases. But you have to be willing to do that extra work. Amazon wasn't interested in doing that. It's just a philosophical difference here. And so the truth is, I'm saying this partially as a warning, which is, if you think you can take masses of data and pull out the demographic information and think a deep neural network won't find another way to get those insights, that's the mistake Amazon made. You have to say, what do we truly know makes for a great software developer? And can we find someone that we believe we can make that transformative difference in their lives? Now the data matters, but the trap of letting the data make the decision with all of its inherent bias goes away. Why do we pretend like science hasn't studied these problems for 100 years and just throw the smartest 19-year-old out of MIT to rebuild our society? Well, guess what? He doesn't know anything about the problem you've given him.
Okay.
Can I add one more point, actually?
Of course, but then we're going to go to a lightning round.
All right.
Go ahead.
But I want to reinforce one thing that Vivienne said earlier that actually is we've also shown now through data. So we looked at sort of the long-term success of our alumni, and again, this was done by an independent research organization. What was really fascinating, actually, and this was very profound for us to kind of rethink about how we've been using our technology, was that we realized there was no difference in earning potential or seniority or long-term success, regardless if that person had prior tech experience or not. In fact, 75% of our workforce doesn't have any tech experience prior coming to the company. And it also, more profoundly, did not matter if they had a degree or not, or if they didn't have a degree. There was no signal in whether or not the college degree or university degree affected the success of long-term in our employees.
And did that cut across gender, race, and economic background?
It does only because, well, I should say this. So because we don't ingest it at the top of the funnel or in our systems, we can only tell by polling after the fact. But generally, yes. Generally, it mirrors the demographics.
I think, I mean, they have a special population. What's very clear is if you're black, having a Harvard degree does a huge amount of work for you. And ignoring that is ignoring the reality of America. Does it actually mean you are a better person because you went to Harvard? No. I mean, that's not what
But it means you are more employable,
Exactly.
which is why Mark Zuckerberg could call his mother and say, I'm dropping out. And his mother would say, that's okay, son. There is no junior black young man in America in a college who's going to call his mother and say, I'm dropping out. and she is going to say back to him, that's okay, son. You're going to be okay anyway.
Okay.
Just because to the point, and this is why the earlier statement that whether or not you have a college degree does not matter is not true. Because for some people in this country, it matters more. And so it's really, really important for us to not generalize, but to understand the context. And the context for vulnerable people historically, black people, brown people, immigrant people, low-income white people, is that their disadvantage is compounded. And the things that many middle-class white people, upper-income white people take for granted as not important are extraordinarily important for them. And so when we talk about, I think it is important to be very clear that which populations we're talking about when we put out narratives about employment, employability, success rates, et cetera, because it's all true. I mean, you're giving facts. I think it will be really important to disaggregate because we need to believe that same thing. We actually need, I want to believe that a smart, young, 21-year-old black man with no BA can actually succeed in America. But the data tell us otherwise.
So we call Mark dropping out risk-taking, and what it really is he didn't have anything to risk because it wasn't risky for him. I do want to be clear, though. What we're saying is the causal factors that predict how long you'll live, how happy you'll be, and earnings are not whether you had a particular degree or not. They are deeper underlying things. But if you have issues, trust me, I don't know if everyone knows this in the audience, but I have raised money as a man and I've raised money for a startup as a woman. If you think it's the same game, you are completely deluded. I don't know if any men in the room have ever had a VC pat them on the head and tell them, you should be so proud of what you've made, who then was the one guy that wouldn't fund us. These things are real, and to pretend they don't exist. But also, I think there needs to be some fidelity to understanding what makes a difference. And the problem for so many people is the thing that would actually predict their success won't get looked at because they don't look like the right person. They have the wrong last name, they have the wrong color skin. So in that sense, yes, these things are transformative and we should encourage and support them, but also understand it's the deeper person that actually makes a change in society. And if I had to choose between sending everyone to university or having a world where people could actually see you for who you are, I realize that's a little delusional, but I know which one I would pick.
So I want to come back. I think that is an excellent place to end. That's why I don't want to end yet.
It's a very polite way to say shut
No, it is, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is not technology. We're talking about human values and how we apply them. And indeed, some things never change or don't change as much as we think they do, notwithstanding everything changing around us. And I think that's critically important as a message out of here. That said, I'd like us to end. I said it's a lightning round. Let's imagine this is Final Jeopardy and you're each James Holzhauser, all right? So we're going to do this fast. And I want to end, if we could, on an optimistic note, which is, and here's the category, the challenge that you think we're going to face in coming decades, that you think you're most optimistic technology can help solve. All right, so we're coming back to solutions here at the end. So a challenge that we're going to face in the coming decades that you are most optimistic technology can help us solve. Darren.
I'm excited and positive and hopeful because young people are hungry for what we're talking about. So there is a consortium, I'm going to steal your thunder a little bit, that we are working on together, Mastercard and Ford, a consortium of 25 universities across the country, computer science departments that are changing their curriculum, that in the case of MIT are building an entirely new school that is interdisciplinary, that will graduate a generation of public interest technologists, of computer scientists who also are trained in the humanities and public policy and who understand the implications for what they are developing. And so I'm actually very positive because I spend a good amount of time on university campuses. And when you spend time with young people, you actually believe in the future. And you see how we old people are getting in their way.
I'm still young, Darren. I don't know about you. I'm still hanging in there. I think that the thing that I'm really excited about is sort of the thesis of the Center for Inclusive Growth, and that is this thesis that there are networks that power the modern economy, and your proximity to these networks determines your success. And I think that the technology that's out there today and the technology that'll be there 50 years from now, rooted in human values, because in the end it is all about human values, and frankly I think it's also about ID, and it is about data. I think that technology will allow us to bring people closer to these networks, to realize their productivity and realize their potential. And I do think that that's the future that we're talking about, one that is sustainable, equitable, and inclusive.
Great. Vivienne. Optimistic.
No, I spend all my days optimistic. I build artificial intelligence, and probably the big story around this is going to take all of your jobs. And we'll have a session about this later.
That's positive.
It's a much more nuanced story than that. What jerks like me are going to do is take away all the stuff that make us all sort of boringly the same. All the rote things anybody with a similar background could do goes away. That will be a much bigger transformation, positive and negative, than people appreciate. But it has this amazing silver lining, platinum lining, which is your marginal value to the economy, to society, is what makes you different. If all the rest of it is gone, the more different you are, the more valuable. So my son has autism. I don't want to cure autism. He also has diabetes. Tough. I built him a little pair of glasses, Google Glass, that could read people's facial expressions, and it writes it on the screen. And he learned how to read facial expressions using this. And it turns out autistic kids that learn how to read facial expressions in natural social interactions also learn empathy, which was assumed to be a separate pathology. It's not a cure for autism. I don't want it to be. He's amazing. I just want him to interact with the world and preserve who he is. If what makes you different is what makes you valuable, my son is priceless. And I want that for everyone. We need more difference in the world. We need technology to augment everything that we truly are, not just sort of augment us into hyper-conformity.
Right on.
Jake.
You know, I think a very simple thing. I think we are on the cusp of killing the resume. You know, a lot of companies are already moving in that direction, you know, and I think ultimately when you start killing the resume, you open up the gates, right? You open up a lot more opportunities for people who maybe don't have the right pedigree, didn't have an opportunity to go to college, or didn't have those abilities to build those muscles when they were earlier in life.
That's great. This has been a phenomenal panel. Thank you to all of you and all of you.